The morning after my wedding, before I had even washed my face, before the coffee was poured, before a single chore was started, my husband asked me to stand in the middle of our bedroom in the gray light coming through the window, and then he looked at me. Not the way a husband looks at a wife, the way an inspector looks at a fence line, slowly, top to bottom, checking for something specific. I was 19 years old, and I did not yet have a word for what was happening. I only knew that I was being examined, and that I was expected to hold still and let it happen, and that somewhere downstairs my mother-in-law was already moving through the kitchen as if this were the most ordinary morning in the world. Before I tell you what he was looking for, and why, and what it took me years to understand about that gray morning, I'm Martha, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl. I grew up old order Amish, and now I tell the stories we were never allowed to say out loud. If you value hearing the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived it, subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. I was 19 when I married Amos. In my community, that was not young. By 19, a girl who was not yet promised had begun to feel the quiet weight of being looked at. School had ended for me at 8th grade, the way it ends for all of us. After that, my education was the kitchen, the garden, the wash line, the younger children, the long discipline of being useful from before dawn until after dark. By 16, I was at the Sunday evening singings. By 17, I understood that courtship was already moving around me whether I spoke or not. Here is the thing outsiders never understand. Amish life is not slow. It looks slow from the road, the buggies, and the lamplight and the fields worked by hand. But the life itself moves fast, because it is built to. The Ordnung, our unwritten but iron code, decides the pace, and the pace does not wait for a girl to be ready. A boy gives you a ride home. He visits on a Sunday evening. Within a season, everyone has decided what you are to each other. My courtship with Amos lasted barely 5 months. He was steady. He was older than me by 4 years. He had a piece of land already and a name that people trusted, and when he chose me, I felt the two things you are supposed to feel and never say. I felt chosen. And underneath that, quiet and cold, I felt caught. Because once you are baptized, and I was, there is no door that opens backward. To leave is to be shunned. To be shunned is to lose your mother, your father, your table, your whole world in a single afternoon. We were married in late November, after the harvest, on a Thursday, the way it is always done. I was awake at 4 a.m. cooking. By noon, there were nearly 300 people in my parents' house and barn. The ceremony went on for hours on the hard benches, the bishop preaching on submission, on the wife who yields, on the building of a godly house. I remember sitting there in my new blue dress, thinking that I could bake for an army, and milk in the dark, and scrub a floor until it shone, and I still had no idea what was expected of me once the lamps were low. After the meal, the roast chicken and the mashed potatoes and the gravy and the pies, after the guests finally thinned, Amos and I went to the house that would be ours. His mother lived in the other half of it, the way mothers do. I want you to hold that detail, because it matters more than I understood that night. We were never as alone as we believed. That first night I will not describe in full, because some of it is mine to keep. I will only tell you that it was uncertain and quiet, and that neither of us knew what we were doing, and that he was not unkind. I fell asleep thinking the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest part came with the morning. I woke before he did. I reached for my dress out of pure habit, the body moving before the mind, and he stopped me. Not roughly. He simply said, "Wait." He said his mother had told him there was a thing that was done the first morning. A thing his father had done, a thing that was proper, and he asked me to stand up, in the gray light, and he looked at me. He was looking for blood, that is the plain truth of it, and I will say it plainly because nobody ever said it plainly to me. In my community, and in many like it, there was an old belief that the marriage was proven on the first night, and that the proof could be seen the next morning on the linen and on the bride herself. He had been raised to understand that checking was not cruelty, it was care, it was duty. It was the same as checking a fence or a foal or a field, a thing a responsible man simply did. And he had been told, somewhere in the silence between men, that a husband had the right to look, and that a good wife would let herself be looked at without complaint. I stood there and let him. I did not know I was allowed to do anything else. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me explain the theology underneath that morning, because the inspection itself was only the surface of something much deeper, and it took me years of therapy to find the words for the three things holding it up. The first was ownership dressed as union. When the bishop spoke of two becoming one, what it meant in practice was that the one was him. My body was no longer only mine the moment the vows were spoken. It became part of the household, like the land, like the stock, like the tools in the barn. And a man inspects what belongs to the household. Nobody ever said the word ownership. They did not have to. It lived in every assumption underneath the word marriage. The second was suffering, treated as proof of virtue. I had been raised to believe that discomfort endured in silence was the mark of a faithful woman, and that a woman who questioned, who flinched, who asked why, was showing Hochmut, pride, the worst sin we knew. So when something felt wrong, the wrongness itself was reframed as a test I was failing. Not a thing to be questioned, a thing to be borne. The third was silence sold to us as modesty. To prepare a bride for any of this, to explain her own body to her, to tell her what was and was not a husband's to demand, would have meant speaking openly about the marriage bed before the wedding, and that alone was treated as improper, almost shameful. So the silence was kept in the name of purity, and the silence is exactly where the harm lived. Put those three together, and you get a 19-year-old girl standing in the gray light of her first married morning, being inspected like livestock, and believing it was holy. I want to tell you about my friend Rebecca, because I was not the only one, and the not being alone is the whole point. Rebecca married 2 years before I did, in a district even stricter than mine. She told me this years later, in a pantry, in a whisper, the way the real things were always passed between us. On her first morning, her husband's mother came into the room. Not her husband, his mother, and the older woman looked at the linen and then looked at Rebecca, and said only, "Good," and folded the sheet and carried it away. And Rebecca lay there understanding for the first time that her wedding night had been graded, and that the grade had been issued, and that she had passed a test she had not known she was taking, on a body she had thought was her own. She did not cry that morning. She told me she cried years later, when she finally understood that the morning could have gone another way, that a husband could have simply held her, that a mother-in-law could have simply knocked and asked if she wanted breakfast, that the inspection was never required by God, it was required by men, and kept alive by women who had survived it and saw no other way to live. Now I am not going to pretend my Amos was a cruel man, because he was not. This is the part that is hardest to hold, and the truest. He inspected me that morning the way he had been taught was right and good. He had been given no more understanding than I had. He had been raised by a father who did it, and a mother who allowed it, and he stepped into the only shape of marriage he had ever been shown. When I think of him now, I do not see a monster. I see a young man who had also been handed lifelong duties before anyone taught him how to be tender, who confused checking for caring, because no one ever drew the line for him either. Years into our marriage, I finally told him how that morning had felt. We were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between us, and I had rehearsed the words for days, and they still came out crooked. I told him I had felt like a thing being measured. He went very quiet, and then he said something I did not expect. He said his father had made him do it, that he had not wanted to, that he had felt sick the whole time and had never known how to say so. We sat there a long while, the clock ticking, the horses shifting in the barn, two people who had shared a bed for years, finally meeting in the truth for the first time. That was the morning the system cracked open for me, even though I stayed years longer. Because I understood then that the inspection had not been one person's cruelty, it had been an inheritance, handed down hand to hand, father to son, mother to bride, generation to generation, and not one link in that chain had ever been allowed to ask out loud whether it was right. When I finally left, at 24, the cost came fast. The shunning settled over me like winter, letters returned unopened, my mother's voice gone from the phone, my father's door closed. The whole texture of belonging that I had been raised inside withdrawn in a season. It was an English doctor, gentle and ordinary, who first gave me language for that gray morning. I described it to her with the new words my therapist had been teaching me, and she listened, and then she said something simple. She said, "You are allowed to say no to that. You were always allowed." And I sat in that office and felt three things rise at once. Relief, that someone had finally said it. Grief, for every morning I had not known, and underneath both, something it took me a long time to name. A slow, cold, enormous anger at a world that had watched generations of girls be inspected like property and called it devotion. My therapist told me a thing I have carried every day since. She said control does not always arrive as a raised hand. Sometimes it arrives as a belief you were handed so young you never thought to question it. The inspection only worked because I believed I had no right to refuse it. The cage was never the looking. The cage was the silence that told me looking was my husband's right. I do not look back on that morning, or on my marriage, with only bitterness, and I want to be honest about that. The plain world gave me real things, a community with a depth most people never feel in their lives, a faith that was beaten and broken and somehow still standing in me, a work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since. But there is no scripture that makes a woman's body the property of the household. There is no God I believe in now who designed a girl and then meant for her to stand in the gray light and be checked like a fence the morning after her wedding. The looking was never holy. The silence that made me hold still for it, that was the thing that needed to die. If you grew up in a place where your body was treated as something to be approved, rather than something that was yours, I see you. If you were ever taught that holding still and saying nothing was the same as being good, I see you too. You were not wrong for the things you let happen before you had the words to stop them. You were a girl with no map, doing the only thing you had been shown. The map was kept from you on purpose. That was never your failing. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.